Tomorrow the BJP seeking votes in the name of the Ram Mandir.
Voters have just been very, very much in support of NDA government.
Talk about inflation and GDP and per capita income is completely illusory. The annual growth rate of real rural wages has become negative.
We are very confident and we welcome an election that is fought on economic issues.
230 million Indians slipped into poverty during the pandemic. You're going to find a very different result.
It's a thoroughly unfair comparison, Rajdeep, for three reasons. First, the UPA inherited an economy in very good health, growing at 8%. And then, of course, they trashed the economy going forward and they left the economy growing at less than 5% with inflation raging at 10%. So, number one, they trashed the economy on their watch. Number two, they didn't have to deal with a once-in-a-century pandemic, which is what we had to deal with COVID. And number three, the kinds of problems that they left us with, which is when we inherited the government in 2014, were very chronic, difficult structural problems that we had to resolve, which we resolved. And in fact, if you look at our record, as I said, we inherited an economy in the ditch, growing at less than 5%. We have made it the fastest growing economy in the world right now.
So let's not sit here celebrating growth figures. What's even more worrying to me is not just that the question of absolute growth, it's who's benefiting from that growth. Because if you look at figures, Jayant rattled off a whole series of categories. I'll try and address some of them. If you look at incomes, where particularly the bottom of the pyramid, the annual growth rate of real rural wages has become negative. For the first time in the last 4 years of NDA, from 2016 to 2021 in India, the top 20% of our population have seen almost a 40% rise in their income growth, whereas the bottom 60% has seen a negative income growth. This is the real problem. The government says improbably that they pull 25 crore people out of multidimensional poverty, but yet 80 crore people are receiving free food grains, which doesn't exactly suggest that people have stopped being poor. We are also looking at a government whose figures, sadly, have become totally unreliable, Rajdeep. One of the sad things about this government is that India used to be respected worldwide for the reliability of its statistics. Now those statistics coming out of Niti Aayog and of the government are not being trusted. Consumption expenditure surveys were not even done for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022. And this national multidimensional poverty index rests on highly dubious and debatable assumptions. So there's a real worry. Let me say on the comparison with UPA, since you wanted me to address that particularly, 27.1 crore Indians were lifted out of poverty according to UNDP between 2005 and 2014. And they said that the poorest 40% in India had the greatest relative development during this period, whereas under the BJP, if you turn to World Bank figures, 230 million Indians slipped into poverty during the pandemic. Nearly 80% of the total number of people in the world who slipped into poverty in 2020 were those in India.
It's the money that goes through Narega as well. So we have to look at all of these transfers and then do a before and after comparison to see whether the rural economy is doing well. Real incomes have gone up by 50%. So yes, we can play around with the numbers, but again, if you go and you ask people, they'll tell you that their lived experience has demonstrated a very significant improvement over the last decade.
But coming to inflation, the fact is that our retail inflation, measured by the CPI, rose to 7.44% in July of 2023. And there's a survey by Kantar this month which says that 57% of Indians are worried about rising prices, which is a significant increase from 27% last year. Why are people worried? Go and take a look at the wholesale markets. In December 2023, you're talking about 5%, 6% inflation. Do you know that the wholesale markets in December 23 were 19.6% higher when it comes to food items like pulses compared to the same month the previous year? Paddy was 10.5% higher, milk is 7% higher, and vegetables in December 23 were 26.3% higher than in December 22. What does this mean? It means that for the Aam Aadmi to go to the market, he cannot afford to buy, or she cannot afford to buy, the same vegetables and pulses and doodh that she was buying for her family 1 year ago with the same amount of money. And the problem is her income hasn't gone up. Incomes have not gone up across the country. That's why this talk about inflation and GDP and per capita income is completely illusory when you look at the real experience of ordinary people in India today.
But let me come back to a very important point that Shashi ji is bringing up, and that is to ask ourselves, how is the median person doing? Right? And you can talk about this data or that data. Ultimately, you have to ask, what are people's sentiments? Are they satisfied with the government in its overall economic management and its overall policies? And the best and statistically the most accurate way to look at that is to actually look and see what voters are doing. And voters have just been very, very much in support of the NDA government and have rejected UPA governments. So that is a composite sense of people's sentiment in terms of whether they're feeling like the government is delivering for them or not, whether the performance of the government is acceptable or not. So to my mind, that is the ultimate litmus test.
You call it self-confidence, I call it complacency. The fact is they're hoping to win on completely other issues rather than the economic well-being of the ordinary Indian. We will turn to the Aam Aadmi and ask them, are you better off today than you were 10 years ago because of any actions of this government? I can assure you that the moment people realize that they're not voting for a government to build temples, they're voting for a government to improve their economic well-being, you're going to find a very different result from the one that is so smugly being proclaimed by my good friend Jayant Sinha's party. I don't think you're going to get the result.
Rajdeep, we are very confident and we welcome an election that is fought on economic issues. On every other issue, of course, we will trump any other party very easily. Economic issues also we will trump everyone else because we have delivered outstanding economic performance, and that's not based on our data alone. It's based on what the world is saying and very reputed agencies around the world are saying. And of course, it is manifested right down to the most remote village and the poorest family in the most remote village.